We are now in the 1 o'clock session, which is kind of the framing conversation for the day. We're going to spend a few minutes talking about human rights broadly. We'll have a couple of case studies, thanks to our wonderful panelists, Asha Kowtal and Brian Citro, in terms of the way human rights are played out in the United States and India, vis-a-vis access to health, protection from sexual violence, access to the courts across the board, and so forth. But we see this as a setup as well to understand the subsequent panels on education and natural resources. So we've been talking for the last couple of weeks and emailing, along with our colleague who unfortunately got stuck in the huge snowstorm on the East Coast, Anisa Rahim, who, like Brian, practices both in India and the United States. So Anisa is not here, but you can read about her on the back, and we're going to do our best to also include things that she might have said today. And the first question that we wanted to discuss, and we've been sort of internally kicking around, is what are the rights that we have? What are the human rights that a person who is a citizen of India, big country, a person who is a citizen of the United States, specifically in Chicago, which means that under our federalist rule is a person who's also a citizen of or resident of Illinois. Sort of what are the ways that we can access justice, access the law? What are the mechanisms that we have when we want to complain about something or we feel that our rights have been abrogated? And the way that we've been looking at it is a little bit of what's on paper, what's in a constitution, what do we have supposedly inalienable? And then how does that actually play out? And we found some surprising contrasts. And I will just kickstart this by saying the reason this seemed very relevant to me is if you take an example like the US Constitution, which has evolved a lot and started off with certain people not being full people and other people being full people and lots of people not being able to vote, things changed and the Constitution has changed. But then in the last century, we decided we needed, for some very good reasons, the Voting Rights Act. In theory, this was to give rights that people already had. That could be parsed quite a bit, I'm sure, but did we need something when we already had the rights? Well, if you couldn't really vote, then clearly you needed another piece of paper. Now, as a country, there's been discussion of some of it's being repealed. What does that mean? So we don't always get to do what it says we get to do, and sometimes we need different activists in different ways to access that. So I'm going to kick us off by asking Brian to just outline this a little bit from a legal point of view.
Sure.
And then after he does that, Asha's going to take us right into her work testing that.
I don't know if we should introduce ourselves, or I guess people have...
So
Okay.
we don't typically do full bio introductions, but Brian is, if you
I'm
can read the back.
I'm suggesting you should do that.
Yeah, exactly.
I'll just jump right in. So yeah, I'm really happy to be here. Thanks to Leslie and Chicago Community Trust and IDS for this event and for inviting me. So I'm wearing two hats because Anisa Rahim isn't here, so I'll try to do my best comparing kind of rights protections on paper and in practice in India and also in the United States. And so I think as a caveat, that question, we could write several books to answer that question and still have a lot more to say. So I'll try to focus on some of the things we've been talking about and also kind of use health maybe as an example, because that's the area that I work in and one of the focuses of this panel. So I guess I think Anisa had said in an email exchange that in India, there's more rights on paper. In the United States, there's less rights on paper, but maybe in India, there's less actual protection or realization of rights as compared to the United States. Now, that might be broadly true, but I'm not sure how far that gets us, because I think it's the devil is in the details. I think and I don't want to get go down a rabbit hole of constitutional law, because it might be a little boring, but from kind of a highest level of kind of abstraction, the United States rights in the Constitution are what we call civil and political rights. So they're mostly also negative rights. So meaning that they're primarily directed toward stopping the government from interfering in your private life, right? So we all now, libertarianism is something that we're all familiar with, given the last couple of years of politics here, and they're essentially libertarian rights. So the right to free speech, the right to practice religion, those are things that are meant to give the individual a larger sphere to do what he or she wants, right? On the other hand, in India, there are those rights in the Constitution, but also what we could call positive or social and cultural and economic rights, which the positive side of it is there's a positive obligation, meaning that the government has an obligation to do something. So like the right to water, the right to health, creates a positive obligation for the government to not only refrain from interfering in individuals' lives, but actually to do something for them to realize these rights. And kind of what the scope and content of those rights are they're constantly up for debate, and kind of it's a shifting landscape. But I think that's probably the most critical distinction. And the interesting thing is, it's really, that distinction could be made between the United States and just about any country that has a constitution that was written in the last 100 years. So the United States, while it's really, as a constitutional democracy, is really a model for just about every other country in the world, it's extremely unique and an outlier with regard to kind of the scope of the kinds of rights that the Constitution creates and that the courts try to uphold. So I think that's a good starting point. And then with regard to kind of access to justice and whether those rights are realized, I think a lot of it has to do with the kind of capacity of the courts, capacity of the government with regard to resources. So in the United States, certainly it's easier to access justice, I think generally, with the caveat that minorities are disproportionately restricted from accessing justice, I mean, understood broadly, whether that means actually accessing courts because of financial barriers or getting justice when they're in court. And that's something, or in their interactions with law enforcement, which we're all thinking about right now over the last year or so, especially here in Chicago. I think in India, while the same rights, right to a fair trial, a habeas corpus to have your day in court if you've been accused of something. Those rights still exist, but because of, for instance, the backlog in the district and village courts in India, and just because of the kind of lack of capacity as compared to the amount of people, those rights often aren't realized, or they're not fulfilled, whereas they are probably fulfilled more here. But if we look at rights such as health, or let's say water or food, which is a good example in India because of the right to food bill. So I would say that while the United States doesn't have a great health system, it's a better health system than what there is in India. But I would argue that over time, India has a chance to develop a better health system than the United States has. And I think part of that is because of this kind of acceptance that the government has a role to play with regard to providing health services, or at least ensuring access to health services. In the United States, so that's to say that there is a constitutional right to health in India. It's not written into the Constitution, it's recognized by the courts through the right to life in Article 21 and through these directive principles that are in the Constitution. Whereas in the United States, there is no right to health at all. So what impact does it have? Does it mean that Americans are less healthy? Of course it doesn't, because we have a lot more money. So for people who can access healthcare in the United States, the healthcare is pretty good. For people who can't access it, well, they're really, they can't access healthcare, and if they have to use the emergency room and use an ambulance, well, they might go in debt severely. So, but my argument with regard to kind of having a better foundation in India is that in the United States, there's no notion that the government has a role except for to regulate the health industry. So if you look at the Obamacare, the Affordable Health Care Act, it's a good example. So I'm not an expert on the act, and we can get lost in the details. But I think an interesting point is that it's a piece of legislation that isn't grounded or supported by any constitutional prerogative. So at any day it could be repealed. There's no obligation that the government actually do anything in the area of health. And I think that's a critical distinction, whereas in India, there's a growing body of jurisprudence within the courts that are building kind of the foundation for what is required. And I don't want to speak for too long. I think a good example of how a constitutional right can influence or inform the development of a kind of more secure legislative framework is the right to food in India. And again, the right to food bill, for those of you who are familiar in how it's been implemented, there's a lot of problems. And I'm not suggesting that the right to food bill has solved the problem of hunger or access to food in India, but it's certainly a step forward. And if you look at the right to food movement, it's a great example of grassroots activism. So those of you who are familiar with it, it's really the product of decades of work of people across the country, activists and community groups on the ground. But when the courts were confronted with the issue, they were able to use the Constitution and the right to food that's, again, judicially recognized through the right to life to say, well, yeah, the Constitution calls for the government to do something, so the right to food bills is sort of a good way to implement or realize this constitutional right. So I think that's a good example, whereas the comparison to the Obamacare, we're not saying, well, great, we have a right to health in the Constitution, this piece of legislation really, makes that right real. Rather, there's no floor, there's no ground. At any day, the rug can be pulled out, and we're left with where we were before, which is 50 million people without insurance. Still, there's numbers that are thrown around, but it's still about 30 to 33 million people without insurance in the United States. And we can go into detail of kind of what that means and how people in India, whether they have insurance or not, kind of what the comparison is on the ground. I think that's a little too much detail. But I think I'll stop there as a comparison between the kind of two constitutional and systems of justice.
Thank you, and I think that we should come back to the health piece for lots of reasons, but the current political climate and the election, quote unquote, Obamacare, which is not actually Obamacare, it's a piece of legislation, tease this up perfectly. I'd like to bring Asha into the conversation. Asha is the General Secretary of the All India Dalit Women's Movement, and her work covers using the judicial, or using human rights in a legislative manner and in other ways through caste, class, prevention of sexual violence, gender violence broadly, in a lots of different ways, some of which also intersect with health. And she's going to kick us off, and I think we're going to start with a video.
Yeah, the video, as you're getting the video on, maybe I can just, please. Just to take off from where Brian left. First of all, it's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me here. I come from India, really representing a country with a very diverse and evolved so-called civil society, and the history of resistance movements and active frameworks, building for new legislations, policies, and there's a lot of action going on at every point in time in the country that I come from. Taking off from where Brian left, I think really the question today, when you're looking at human rights framework from India, is really the question of impunity. And when I say impunity, I say that as really a pipeline of impunity from the ground level up to, say, the highest diplomatic levels. And for this, what I'm trying to say is that, like, impunity that exists where police officers are refusing to file the cases in the police station to start with at the ground level, the first point where you would want to access justice, to the highest level of impunity, what we see perhaps in the corridors of the United Nations, where our diplomats refuse to even accept human rights violations that are taking place within the borders of our country, and yet are signatory to every treaty and every convention that exists in the international human rights standards. So the question of institutional failure, whether it is at that police station or at that district level, right up to the United Nations. And we see this at every stage where actually cases of violence, cases of discrimination, cases of structural exploitation, denial of rights and resources is taking place so systematically. And as Brian rightly pointed out, and as Anisa has already mentioned in her emails, we're coming from a country where there's really no dearth of policies, legislations. We have a very revolutionary constitution to back up everything. Really, like, you want anything in the country, food, employment, water, Everything will be given to you in a silver platter. This is the policy for you. This is the framework. These are the rules. These are the legislation frameworks that exist. But really, when it comes to the enforcement and the unchallenged culture of impunity that exists is actually really a very large human rights issue for us in the country. And when I say all of this, I think, friends, it's very important to understand this within the existing context from our country. On one hand, we have like this whole capitalist model of development that's being pushed within the country and also in the international market, as well as really looking at rising fundamentalism, religious intolerance, a lot of violence. Also, the deep-seated biases that exist, whether it's patriarchy, whether it's caste, whether it's language, and all of this within this kind of a triangulated situation of the market, rising intolerance, and also deep-seated structural violence and discrimination that exists. Where does this really human rights discourse or this kind of human rights language that we are speaking, whether it's within India or whether it's within the international human rights frameworks, is something that we really need to consider. My work in India is, as was mentioned, is with the All India Dalit Women's Rights Forum. I don't know how much this group is familiar about caste and as a structure of discrimination and stratification that has existed within the Indian society. But really, we're talking about 260 million people who actually were called as the former untouchables and who have been bearing the brunt of social, economic, and political exclusion based on the caste which they were born into. My work is specifically with the women belonging to the lowest caste groups who actually experience multiple forms of discrimination, violence, one being born as a woman and the patriarchy and gender violence, intersecting with her being born as an untouchable and actually the untouchability and other forms of violence because of her caste, and of course obviously poverty and class-based discrimination that she experiences. So my work is at the grassroots level, really working with survivors of violence, looking at different kind of models for advocacy and demanding for legal rights and redressal. With that, I just have so that I don't end up speaking a lot, which sometimes I do, I just want to stop. And then we have a very small 3-minute little clip, which actually, so that I don't speak about it, but you can actually see how the campaign is actually organizing on the ground, only to demand accountability from India. We're really not asking anything from the heaven above, but really what is already there within the Constitution and within our legislative rights. So maybe somebody could turn off the lights. Yeah, thank you.
There comes a point when you can't take one more headline. When you are sick of the violence and you are tired of being afraid.
उसके बाद जब हम वो जानवर की जिंदगी भी जी रहे हैं, उसके बाद भी फिर हमें जानवरों की तरह यूज भी करते हैं लोग। क्योंकि मैं गरीब हूँ, मेरे पीछे सपोर्ट करने वाला नहीं है कोई। ये फिर गाली गलौज करने लग गया। फिर जब एकदम मैंने कहा पीछे कर अपनी पिस्तौल, मैंने कहा क्या मार ही देंगे, लेकिन जब उसके बाद ने एकदम उसने ना ऐसे करके घुमाई तो उसके अंदर मैडम बिल्कुल गोलियां।
Dalit women's bodies are used as a battleground for the caste war. The attacks on our bodies that are used to teach a lesson to the larger community.
In 2014, a courageous band of women came together to take on the caste system and to say enough is enough.
ఏది పీస్, ఏది జస్టిస్, ஒரு நாட்டில் கலவரம் நடக்கலாம், ஒரு நாட்டில் ரயாட் நடக்கலாம், ரத்தம் சிந்தலாம், துப்பாக்கியோட சத்தம் கேட்கலாம். அந்த நாட்டில் ஜஸ்டிஸ்
The National Crime Records Bureau, which is the government data, it's not our data. According to that data, there are like 5 Dalit women who are raped every day in the country. And in friends, this is a completely, wrong figure, absolutely bogus, because these are cases where, like, in just 3 districts of Haryana, which is about less than 120 kilometers from Delhi, we had recorded 22 cases of gang rapes in less than 45 days. So that actually shows the extent of violence, which actually the government data would never ever show. And when we speak about campaigns like this, we are actually talking about really looking at demanding for implementation of legislations. Like in India, we have a 25-year-old legislation called as the Scheduled Caste, Scheduled Tribes Prevention of Atrocities Act, which is a special legislation which actually looks at protecting rights of Adivasi women, those are the tribal women, and also the Dalits. We have also, after the unfortunate incident of 2012, the Nirbhaya case, where after which the women's movement and all other human rights groups demanded for amendments in the IPC, that's Indian Penal Code, and brought changes into the criminal law. We have legislations like the POCSO, which looks at child offenses, sexual offenses against children. We have like a plethora of legislations which would actually protect the rights of these women. But ultimately, we are having to confront with institutions that are meant to protect us and actually give us rights, but actually it sometimes seems like whether these institutions were actually designed to fail us or what. And that is really the question that the movement is asking today.
Asha, thank you so much for taking us into this and seeing the challenge that you're facing across a number of issues. And what I'm wondering is, Brian, maybe you can expand this to particularly the work you've been doing in trying to bring healthcare specifically. How does that parallel interface in that work in India that you've been doing?
Yeah, so I guess I had the fortune to work at the Lawyers Collective with Anand Grover and Indira Jai Singh, so I'm not sure if anyone's familiar with their work, but the part of the work is on women's rights, the other part is on HIV/AIDS, which has now been kind of more broadly working on health issues. And it's working on health issues through litigation and like legislative advocacy, and also some kind of, especially in the HIV context, grassroots organizing and community-based work. So my work there for the 2.5 years I was there is really supporting the work of the Lawyers Collective, and I learned a lot about kind of how the law has been used. There's so many things to talk about if we're looking at health broadly and kind of thinking about how the law, whether it's constitutional rights or legislation, makes an impact in promoting access to health. I think what I have the most experience with is looking at how litigation and kind of constitutional rights or movements that are at least in part based on both international human rights and constitutional rights in India have made an impact. And I think in the area of HIV is probably the most obvious and maybe the best example of where there's been success. And I think in that respect, it's a serious model for all of us. And I have a project that works on tuberculosis globally, but in India and China, and where we directly take from the successes in the HIV, the fight against HIV movement. So in India, the access to first-line HIV medicines have been free and provided by the government pretty successfully for over a decade, or just about almost 2 decades now, or 10, 15 years. And as an example of how the law can make an impact, that whole process started through a couple pieces of litigation from the Lawyers Collective and the Human Rights Law Network, which is another organization that does strategic health litigation. They basically had been bringing cases in the high courts. So in India, I was going to do like what's the court system? So there's the Supreme Court, which is similar to ours, which is the kind of the highest court of the land. Then there's high courts for every state. And the high courts for every state are kind of like our federal appellate courts and our state Supreme Courts put into one. For anyone who's a lawyer in the room, for those of you who aren't, it's boring to explain, so I won't. But so essentially, you would go to you can go directly to the high court through what's called a public interest litigation, which is a really interesting procedural innovation that in India, which basically allows people to, rather than like in the United States, you have to go through the district court, the appellate court, and then you would go to the Supreme Court. In India, the public interest litigation changes or relaxes what we call standing, and allows you to go directly to a high court and sometimes directly to the Supreme Court if it's a constitutional challenge that's in the public interest. So there's some criticism of that, but with regard to this conversation, it's really it really opened up access to the courts. And also, you don't have to show that you're the one being harmed. So the Lawyers Collective as an institution can go on behalf of people living with HIV, for example, which is what happened in the kind of story that I'm telling. So essentially, they argue that the right to life and the right to health were being violated because people didn't have access to medicines. People were dying when there were medicines that were available. And at first, they were unaffordable. Then they became affordable, but people still weren't accessing them because the government hadn't coordinated to sort of buy the medicines. And on the private sector, if they were available, they're very expensive. So the Supreme Court basically said, yes, this is a good argument. The constitutional rights, it looks like it would be a violation if people are dying from a disease that has not a cure, but at least medicines that can prolong life significantly. So what they did, and I think this is really interesting, is they forced the government, meaning the Ministry of Health at that time, which later then, I think also it was the NACO, which is the National AIDS Council, which is basically a government organization that's created to deal with HIV. They said you need to sit down with the litigants and also with people living with HIV, and you need to work this out. So you need to find a solution. And through this dialogue, which is sort of mediated by the courts, and again, kind of founded upon, or the overarching issue is that there's constitutional violations happening. Through that dialogue, they were able to create a system whereby first-line and now second-line treatment for HIV is free and fairly mostly available. And I think that's a really good example of how access to the courts through this public interest litigation facilitated the ability to use the Constitution to really force the hand of the government to deal with what was and is, to a bit of a lesser extent, a serious public health problem.
I'm going to bring it back home for just a second.
Sure.
In terms of this, on two fronts, and I want to ask Asha the second question. But the first one is, in the growing libertarian movement that we have in the United States, and given that we don't have a right to life in the Constitution per se, in the way that you're describing in India, there's obviously an enormous amount of data that these kinds of public health crises, HIV, tuberculosis, which we should provide health care for because we should, but would there not also be data, or do you think that there has just governments, the cost of these diseases in both countries is enormous, the cost to the GDP, I mean, on and on. This is discussed and it's known, but do you think without the legal framework it just isn't enough to move?
You mean to kind of overcome the cost barrier? Well, yeah, I think so. HIV and tuberculosis in the United States the treatment is free and provided by the government, which is unusual. I think the cost. I mean, in India, people think of India as a poor country, but it has considerable wealth. The government and both within the private sector. So it's not really the case that we can say, well, people can't access healthcare or HIV treatment because it's just a poor country. It's not really the case. I think if let's take a country like Niger, for example. That's a very poor country where legitimately the government doesn't have enough money on its own to kind of do what's necessary. I don't think anyone would argue that's the case with India, and I think that creates a double, incentive or imperative to solve these problems. But so financial barriers, I don't think are always the case. I mean, and I think in the United States, the problem with accessing healthcare is that people don't have access at all because they don't have insurance. And also the cost of healthcare. I mean, so one thing Obamacare didn't do anything about is lower the costs. And so we basically have healthcare costs that are larger, I mean, by ridiculous magnitudes in any place in the world. So it requires a health insurance system where the health insurance companies are paying a lot of money for people to access health care, and so therefore they make it harder and harder to include people. So I think that's probably the largest problem in the United States. Now, if there was a right to health that was just as kind of vigorously protected as the right to free speech, for example, I think we'd be in a dramatically different place, and I think our health system, it might be a single payer health system actually, but I think even the kind of market-based system we have would have regulations that would not just require you to get health insurance or receive a penalty, but would really take steps toward ensuring people on the bottom had access to basic health care.
Yeah, please do.
I don't know how many of you have, lived or visited India, but now if you walk into any of these five-star, not hotels, but five-star hospitals in our country, you find like they are so fancy and so like, I don't know whether you go there for treatment or what, but you would find like there's one separate section for medical tourism, like in the sense like people who come from outside the country for treatment within the country because they get like really inexpensive treatments, but particularly surgeries and stuff like that. So there's a whole new market which is actually aimed at bringing in patients from abroad to the country for treatment. But at the same time, when we have a completely crumbling public health infrastructure, we have something called as the National Rural Health Mission, National Urban Health Mission, which actually allocates like thousands of crores of rupees on actually strengthening the public health delivery. But we see that, like I mean, it's terrible actually when we sit here and talk about situation of health and access to education and health in India, where we see that so many lives are being lost every day just because there is no, access to basic health care. And really the question comes about, where is then all this money that is being allocated to public health infrastructure, building and service delivery really going to?
Can I make just a quick comment, a personal story? I was just in India with my family in November, and my father fell ill from low blood pressure, and we were in Gurgaon, which is it's a suburb. It's kind of becoming its own city just near Delhi, and we went to one of these five-star hospitals, and just to compare the costs. So we took an ambulance there, and my father they weren't sure if it was a heart attack, so he was given cardiac tests and 3 or 4 other tests at one of the nicest hospitals in India. It was 9,000 rupees was the total, which is like $150 essentially. I don't have the numbers, but I assume if that would happen in the United States at a comparable hospital, it would be maybe $15,000, $20,000. So imagine, much higher. I'm being generous, right? So think of that disparity. But the problem is that if somebody in India who can't afford the 9,000 rupees, which is a lot of money in India for many, many people, the kind of, it's relatively the $15,000-$20,000 is just as much, if not more, for many, many people in the United States. So in a sense, the disparity that exists that Asha is describing, it's the same kind of disparity that we have here, and it's in part because of the private market-based system that we have.
Folks who are standing in the back, please do use the seats up here. We'd love to have you. We're going to have questions from the audience, and it's easier to talk up close. Asha, 2 things strike me that Brian was talking about kind of innovative ways to file cases. In the United States, as we've discussed, it's a very long slog up. We have more points of entry possibly, but you are not going to get to the Supreme Court kind of in one go or briefing. It seems that you believe that impunity is this very powerful negative force that's stopping. Do you think that there are ways, or can you describe the ways that your organization as a community, as we've just beautifully seen, community-led organization, how are you trying to trip those levers? How are you trying to use the tools you have?
I would think like I could quickly give an example. Very often when I'm talking about my work and particularly the survivors of violence, it's really very emotional. On one hand, I'm like so angry with the system that is failing us. On the other hand, so much of grief and sadness for losing our lives. But at the same time, hope that, you know, the system will deliver justice for us at some point in time, and that's the reason why we do what we do. So in this case of this girl who was, found dead in the fields, and after we found the case, we had done like a fact finding. She was going for her final year examinations to be a teacher. And so when we did the fact finding and found out the details of the case, we had to kind of take it up with the police. And for the autopsy, the postmortem for her, really, friends, for 7 days we protested with the body of the girl. 3 postmortems were done, 2 in Haryana, then 1 in AIMS, that is All India Medical Science Institute in Delhi, to kind of get the evidence to show that this was actually a gang rape and murder. And then we used different kind of innovative tools. We had like an online petition that was going thousands and thousands of signatures online. We have something called as the commissions, with like Women's Rights Commission for Women. We have a commission for children. We have a commission for scheduled caste, scheduled tribe people. So we had individual complaints filed at these. They did their own fact-finding investigations. We had like built a lot of pressure to get a special investigation team at the district level to actually follow up on this case. So that was one line. We were actually looking at engaging with the bureaucracy in terms of getting some compensation or some kind of legal support for her. We work closely with HRLN, the organization that Brian mentioned, Human Rights and Law Network. We actually filed a petition straight into the Supreme Court. We did all of these things, like on one hand, mass mobilizing. We had a lot of protests. We were working with the commissions. We were working with building international pressure, looking at media, looking at organizing the people on the ground. Ultimately, after everything, all of this was done, and ultimately the final closure report which came from the police and every other commission was, this was a case of suicide. That's it. So, in spite of all of these actions that were done, this was finally what we did. But the only hope was that because of our PIL that was there in the Supreme Court of India, that we finally, after like almost 6 months after the case was over, it was late, but then we got another order from the Supreme Court to actually constitute another special investigation team to actually follow up on this case. Of course, the life of the girl is gone. And, we lost perhaps a teacher who was wanting to be a teacher in our country, but still we continue to work with the judicial system through existing mechanisms like the PILs. We have like working with a team of lawyers at the ground level, because yes, Supreme Court, High Court is one matter, but really the first level of engagement with the survivors to actually even look at the documents and take the case into the legal system is something that we are working at the ground, the lower courts. What we have also seen is that many times like a lot of work is happening at the ground level. The lower courts, maybe even up to there we are able to get some kind of judgment so that the perpetrators are actually, having some kind of conviction. But what we are seeing is most of the cases, when they come to the high courts, that is where we are actually losing out on most of the cases. If you see, there have been, if you even Google, you can find like so many mass crimes that were conducted on Dalit families, whether it was Bihar, the Lakshmanpur Bate, Chunduru case in Andhra Pradesh. We see that for 10 or 12 years continuously we followed up on these cases. At the High Court we got solid, strong judgments. Everybody was celebrating, but then later on all the people who were convicted, they got away scot-free. So there are challenges at different levels, but yes, our country, being a democracy that it is, does offer us a different means of actually trying different permutations and combinations to actually finally get justice.
Thank you. It sounds like a lot of work on every level. We started a little bit late, so I think we're going to run just a smidge late. We'd love to take some questions from the audience, if anybody has any. Sir. And I'm going to ask you to speak up if you would be kind. Thank you.
Looking at reports in the press on India, there were 600 rape incidences in Delhi, but only one conviction. But 85% of the rapes that happen in the country happen between relatives, friends, family members when children are molested. So 85% of the rapes that happen in India are not gang rapes. That is the area where we need to concentrate. At least that's what we had a brainstorming session of about 8 or 12 Indian people, and we went through this for 8 hours, and that was the conclusion. Second, healthcare is well handled both in India and in the United States, but there are different problems looking at it. On human rights, India has problems on human rights because 40% of the government justices are unoccupied. There is no justice. There is no judges appointed. So unless you get a full judge section, you're not going to have law. There is an average 20-year backlog, 15 to 20 years backlog in handling cases of major cases. So I think we have to look at the total picture. As far as the Dalit movement, I must say one thing. Just yesterday I saw a movie, Awakening India. And there were 3 cases shown at the University of Chicago, out of which a lot of headway is being made for minorities or Dalits. And even in poverty, the poverty rate in India over the last 10 years has reduced by almost half. So India has made tremendous progress in its state. Thank you.
I'm going to thank you. So we're going to turn those into questions just a little bit, and I would encourage the audience to take advantage of our panelists by asking a question, but perhaps, do you have a response to both of these? I mean, these are interesting statements.
Maybe I have the easier response, but I mean, which is just, yes, you're right, about the backlog and empty judicial seats. And I think both, there's also a competency problem as you go down. I mean, India has some of the best judges in the world in some of the high courts on the Supreme Court, and I've been lucky to interact with them. We just had a judicial workshop in December where we had justices from the Supreme Court and the Delhi High Court, some of the other high courts, and yeah, they're as good as the best judges from anywhere in the world and better than most. But even amongst the Supreme Court, because there's so many judges, and even amongst many of the high courts, there's a big disparity in terms of, I would say, the quality of the judges. So that's kind of, along with the backlog and the empty seats, that's another, I think, problem. And as you go down, what I heard, I was in, where was I at? It was in South India, in Dindigul district in Tamil Nadu, and we were in a small town where what we learned was that the lawyers who graduated from this local law school, the ones who couldn't get a job in the private sector, they're the ones who became judges in the local courts. So you basically, and you had the people who did the worst in law school who are becoming the lower court judges. The backlog is a major problem. I think it's most it's kind of most serious in the lower courts. But I spoke with a justice in the Delhi High Court just last month, and he's also talking about, as hard as he's trying, there's no way that he can get to all the cases. Or you get to all the cases and you do so, it's in a cursory matter. So that's a major problem. Empty judicial seats, I'm not as much aware of. I think that's probably also, again, in the lower courts, because the remuneration isn't enough. There's not enough pay, which is, again, why you have not only a quality issue, but probably a vacancy issue. So I think those are great points.
So what you're bringing out is actually a huge matter of debate. I don't think it would be possible to do that in this forum. Really, actually looking at the politics behind the data itself and from where that data is coming. Look at every government data, not my data. Look at all the government data, whether it is NFHS, looking at the education data, you would see the vast disparity that exists within different communities. I'm not saying change is not happening. Definitely change is happening, but the disparity and this poverty index, the way in which it is being calculated or was calculated before is a whole different question. When we're talking about intimate partner violence and what you mentioned, there's no doubt about it. Yes, there is a lot of domestic violence, there's a lot of sexual abuse that is happening. The point that I'm trying to make is really about take a look at the conviction rates. The conviction rates, whether you're looking at IPC sections and the conviction rates, which are always in decimal figures when it comes to to special legislations. Here we are talking about cases, when I say 5 Dalit women are raped every day in the country, these are the perpetrators who are belonging to the dominant caste men, and groups of dominant caste men and mixed groups of men. They are not cases of domestic violence or intimate partner violence. We have to look at it much more broadly. Yes, it is there, domestic violence. At the same time, we're looking at structural violence, which is not something new. This has existed for way too long. Today, what we are seeing is a new trend of backlash violence, a kind of a revenge violence that is taking place, whether it is Dalit women who are contesting elections in the panchayats, whether it is those who are getting into academic institutions, or those who are making some kind of forward movement, and violence is being used systematically to actually push back. And that is the whole question that this movement is actually asking.
Thank you. We're going to take one more question. Sir?
My name is Jatinder Bedi. When I saw Mr. Bryant coming up on the panel, I thought today India had it. But I must compliment Mr. Bryant for bringing out such beautiful aspects of Indian Constitution and Indian legal system that I believe must have removed so many misconceptions, not only from American audience today, also from many of our Indian audience who might not have visited India for a very long time. Thank you so much. While you were talking about PIL to be filed in Supreme Court or High Court, public interest litigation, I want to bring out one more medium to which this issue is addressed, and that is that if nobody is filing and the court itself sees that something is happening which is wrong or is a violation of any type of right, they can issue a suo moto order and invite or call or summon the person concerned in the court on basis of information which they have gathered through any way, including media.
Yeah.
So I must thank you for that. And now coming to Ms. Asha, while we are talking of these data and statistics, you know, the way the things are portrayed abroad, it might give an idea that there is a hahakar in India and there is something not right at all and India is on degeneration and immunity is there and all those stuff. But the question is that when people embark on your visits abroad to address these issues, whether it is domestic violence or Dalit suppression outside the country, and when you create the data, my question from you is that do you keep in mind or do you collect the data of other countries in which such violence of comparative nature of equivalent to the Dalits or equivalent to their domestic violence take place? And do you compare with Indian data and statistics that which is the better of country? That is one question. And second is, when you do this comparative study, do you keep in, if at all you do, if you have not done that, but if at all you do, when you do this comparative study, do you take in consideration various factors which are the habitats of two different societies, the educational level, the type of violence they are undergoing, and especially so, the enormity of population. India is such a big country, and then when you take the statistics, of course, one wrong committed is a wrong committed. But question is, when we are blaming or naming or tagging a country, so the proportion has to be sizable enough to be bring these aspects abroad in a foreign population. So my question from you is that what do you do with this data? How do you collect it? And do you do the comparative?
Very often, especially during the interactions at the UN, where a lot of advocacy work is happening for more than a decade, this is the same question which is asked by the Indian diplomats to us. So I really don't know how to answer this, because it's really not a question of naming or shaming the country. That's not the objective of human rights activists who have been talking about human rights violations or exploitations in the country. It's really the question of state accountability and enforcement of the law. To answer your second question about comparison of data within different countries, a lot of work has happened within countries in South Asia, where there are a lot of where the 260 million people that I'm talking about. It's not a small isolated figure somewhere in the corner of the world, but it is a number that's perhaps larger than some of the countries of this world itself. That's another point that I want to make. In terms of comparison, I would say that recently we were here on a North American tour where we met a lot of other radical feminist organizing, and especially looking at women of color organizing that happens here. Definitely race and caste are two different structures, but very analogous, and we found so many similarities in the kind of history of violence and exploitation, and also institutional failures that have been happening here in your country as well as back home in India. And that only led us to certain solidarity actions, but we don't have any data that would compare this and this and this. I wish there would be some research agency that would want to take up that task.
Thank you. Only because we have two incredible next panels to have during this session. We're going to wrap this up, but our panelists will be here, and I hope that you'll continue to talk with them. I'd like to thank Asha very, very much, and to direct all of you to information and literature on the table about the National Dalit Women's Network. Please be involved, learn more. They have a great website and videos. I'd like to thank Brian very, very much for taking us on a tour through both legal systems. We obviously struggle with the same kinds of problems here and there is much to learn from. We're going to take a very short break, and then Steve Bynum is going to talk with us and our panelists about the right to educational access and parity or lack thereof, and we're going to learn about some innovative things. So stretch your legs, get up, come back, get some more food, and we'll keep going.